Heather, would you please
Yes,
tell us about this?
we have an app called Libby by Overdrive. And if you download it to your phone, you can listen to them right on your phone, just like Audible. You can, create lists of books so that if you want to read them, you can remember them. It's great.
Would you
That is
repeat the name?
brilliant.
It's called Libby,
Oh, Libby, yes.
Libby.
Libby.
Yes. And you just need to sign in with your library card number and pick your home library. If you're not a Denville resident, pick your library within the main system. So
that's
it's really cool.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And it works on Kindles as well, if you want to read ebooks.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather.
Yeah.
I'm going to take advantage of that myself.
Yeah, we can help if you get stuck with the app or it starts asking where, just give us a call and we'll walk you through it.
And this is why the Denville Library is the place to be.
For
Right?
sure.
We have people attending from different towns. We actually have someone attending from out of state. Can you imagine that? John Ritter here, my friend from the West Coast. As you can see, he's in his office because, of course, it's a 3-hour time difference. And just so you know, Johnny Ritter, you are attending a town that was voted by a major realtor company as the greatest suburban town in all of the United States. So you are basically virtually here in Denville with us. So we thank you for visiting us today.
I feel honored.
Well, we're honored to have you. Heather, I'm going to turn things over to you for any
Okay.
announcements you have.
Thanks to everybody for joining us tonight for our second installment in Alex's series on fantasy races. And last week was dwarves, tonight is elves. And I believe it's the following week
Correct.
is
Next week, we'll be finishing with goblins.
goblins. So we're pleased to welcome you here and so pleased to have Alex teaching these very entertaining and informative programs for us.
Thank you very much, Heather. And just so you know, every week I come by and slip Heather a $10 bill. And for that, she gives me these wonderful compliments. Well, thank you all for attending tonight. It is a lecture that is entitled, and I'll go ahead and put the title up in case you didn't see it in the catalog, A Brief Cultural History of Elves. And if you were here last week, you'll get what this little tiny joke is. And yes, it is elves, meaning last week we talked about dwarfs with an F, or was it dwarves with a V? Tolkien's spelling of dwarves. Why? Because he wanted to make them sound old and ancient and Eldar like the elves were. But yes, when you pluralize elf, you get elves. So there's that little point. What I'd like to do just as a quick point off the bat is to mention that just for my own purposes, as a teacher, as somebody that's been teaching in front of a lot of different types of crowds over the years, one thing I do pride myself on is to uphold and respect the beliefs of those in my audience or those in my classroom and so forth. And I'm saying that on purpose because, as you know, we may be in a room with people who have different religious or philosophical beliefs than us. And I never like to make fun of those beliefs. Now, the reason I mention this is because something's going to come up in today's lecture that may surprise you. What people have believed and what many people even today believe. And I will do my best to put that in an elevated sense and not to make light of those beliefs. That's just my little caveat that I want to mention from the outset. Okay, so that said, one quick visual for you, which I think is worth doing, is this, a comparison of images.
Mhm.
And yes, Samantha, this is just for you. Here on the left-hand side, we have fan art. A fan at some point had painted this beautiful painting of an elf, very well-known elf in Tolkien mythology, Glorfindel, the most powerful, if not the most powerful elf referenced in Tolkien's mythology. And that's kind of the iconic elf as far as the fantasy world is concerned. If somebody plays Dungeons and Dragons, if somebody watches or reads or plays video games that are in the fantasy genre, what they're shown is somebody who's strong, somebody who's almost beautiful in appearance, perhaps very fair skin, possibly. So most times fair hair, but not always, could be dark hair as well. Tall, almost angelic-like. And of course, the pointy ears kind of give away the fact it's not a human. But there you have a very different image than what we see on the other side of the page. And that's your cute worker elf. This I just took an image from Santa's Elves, as there's tons of that on Google I could have pulled from. Can you think of anything that shows a bigger dichotomy than these two images? And yet when you say the word elf, people may conjure one or both of those images. So I'm just curious, how many of you here, when you hear the word elf, think of the cute, small, hard worker, maybe mixing batches of cookies in a tree kind of elf with the curly shoes and so forth? How many get that image when you hear the word elf?
Oh.
So I see some hands on that. How many see it the other way? Oh no, that when I think of an elf, I think of what Tolkien came up with. Okay, not a surprise that Johnny and Samantha, because they're both Tolkien readers, that they have that viewpoint. So I thought that was good to show you that comparison of images right from the forefront of our lecture today. And that is based on the first point I wanted to make to you. We are going to break those two images down, where we'll start with Tolkien, keeping to a similar format that we did last week, not starting at the oldest reference or references to elves. Like last week, we didn't start with the oldest references to dwarves, but rather starting in the middle, so to speak, in a place called Middle Earth, a place that Tolkien created in his mythology, because much of what he had written in 1937 with The Hobbit, in the late 40s and into the 50s with the Lord of the Rings series, really set the tone for the image that many people have. Then after we look at Tolkien's mythology and his version of elves, then we will go back to what may have influenced him. And I say what may have influenced him. That's an important distinction, because you're going to find there's a lot of very new scholarship on the oldest references to elves coming from Viking belief. You'll also notice that I have here a term, parenthetical statement, the invisible population. I will explain what is meant by that. That's not my term. It's a term that comes from some Norse experts. After that, I think it's a good idea we look at some of the Grimm's fairy tales. So you could probably name off the top of your head, Elves and the Shoemaker, right? We'll look at that. And then we'll look at worker elves. It's not just Santa who had worker elves, but bear in mind, there's elves like the Grimm's fairy tales, or maybe those that work for Keebler and whatnot. We want to take a few moments to see that image and why it's so strong. Then I thought it'd be a good idea to return to Tolkien after that, just to show you how everything preceding this could give different interpretations when someone reads Tolkien or views it in a movie or cartoon form. And then last but not least, and for those that weren't here last week, this is a continuing feature. We have a little conundrum, a riddle, if you will, a continuing question over the figure Rumpelstiltskin. Okay. Rumpelstiltskin is described simply in the Grimm's Fairy Tales 1812 as a little man. Was he a dwarf? Was he an elf? Was he a goblin? See, that thread is going to continue through our lectures. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into Tolkien's theories and his concepts. And I just want to show you a little bit about how artists have depicted some of the locations in his mythology. So I just pulled up some fan art that's been done, some of it decades and decades ago. A couple of very important cities. Now, Samantha, who's read the Silmarillion before, it's one of the least read books that Tolkien has written. You had the very ancient city of Gondolin, a city built by the elves, a city that predates humankind before their creation, and how it's so glorious and almost beyond comprehension that something like this could exist. When you get into the Lord of the Rings series, Gondolin has already been destroyed. It's something that comes up as a very important storyline in the Silmarillion. But when you're reading the story about Frodo and Sam, and of course, Legolas and Gimli and all those individuals, you'll note they all visit a place called Imladris, or otherwise known in more English speak, Rivendell, a very fantastical kind of city in the mountains. And again, glorious beyond comprehension to what humans could build. You could also look at some other images, like what has made a distinction by Tolkien, this split between different families of elves. The fact that there's hierarchy. There's whole genealogies that are given in his appendices. We talked about that with dwarves last week. Well, even more so with the elves, do you see these long family lines that are given from very famous families, some of which that are considered to be much more noble than others. So looking at those preceding cities, those would be used where the high elves would be considered, the ones that are the city dwellers. Here we have some art depictions of a place called Lothlorien, which does have some elves of rank there, but it's definitely a wooded area. This is very beautifully depicted if you get a chance to see the Lord of the Rings series, especially the Fellowship of the Ring done by Peter Jackson back in 2001. Really well done. This here you're looking at here is a well-known piece of artwork to most Tolkien fans from the brothers Hildebrandt, who I had some images from last week. And then if you want to go into a place called Mirkwood, which is one of the name that the elves had for it, but it was a murky place full of big spiders and kind of scary stuff. Well, that's where a whole other family of elves may live. These are more wood elves. They don't come from the same stock necessarily as the high elves. So there's these distinctions that come up, and I think that's just an important concept to bring out. How do the elves come into existence in the first place? Well, this is what's important to understand. As a review of last week, and just a point for those who may have missed, remember that Tolkien's mythology is monotheistic. He was a very staunch Catholic. In fact, he could be labeled as an Oxford Christian. That's sometimes how he's labeled, being that he was a Christian, Oxford University, someone who almost found religion again during and after his experience in World War I. And he really delved into his own faith, delved into the Bible, and pulled some imagery from the Bible. So to him, you could see when you read, when he's talking about elves created by this one God, of course, the God has a different name in his mythology, they are really angels. If there's no doubt about it, any Tolkien scholar will tell you that. And yes, there are different ranks or different levels of these heavenly beings, much like in biblical reference. And if I may say, also in specifically Catholic doctrine, ranks of angels. You may have heard of seraphs before, or cherubs, or archangel. And in the Catholic faith, there's many archangels in that faith. So you kind of have that concept in his writing that the first of all of his intelligent creatures are these heavenly beings that come from these different classes. You may hear terms like the Valar, those that are of the heavens, so to speak, or in his case, across the sea. Okay, so there's the reference. Or the Maiar. And then there's this lower rank of elves that you might say. And the elves kind of take that place of those messenger elves, close connected to humankind. Biblical accounts will show you some close connection. Elves that had ministered to some of worshipers of God, but again, would never want to be worshipped. That's a very important concept in Tolkien's mythology. They're not supposed to be worshipped. As you can think of one particular angel who said that to one of the prophets. No, don't worship me, worship God. He was definitely pulling from those references. So that means that elves technically don't age the same way as a human would. And if you say, well, why would they age at all? Well, if you read the Silmarillion, and if you ever talk with Samantha Timon, a Denville resident, she can go on for a long time because she loves that book and tell you there's a whole episode where the elves are allowed to come down to Earth. And they're only supposed to be there for a limited amount of time. But some of them like it so much they stay. They start building homes, they start marrying each other, they start having families, building cities. And then unfortunately, what that leads to is some contention between them, civil wars, and also the rise of the great enemy, Melkor, otherwise known as Morgoth, and then his chief lieutenant Sauron, who's the more well-known individual in the Lord of the Rings series. Interestingly enough, I got a chance to read a letter. It's a very lengthy letter by Tolkien when he was reaching out to a friend of his, a fellow writer and editor of several magazines, a man named Milton Waldman. And back in 1951, Milton Waldman had reached out to Tolkien and said, listen, I don't really understand your mythology. Could you please explain it to me? And he apologizes to him and says, I'm sorry, but you just asked a writer to write you a response. And so what followed was a 16-page letter explaining his mythology. If you read that beautiful document, he really explains who the elves are. And he makes references to the angels. And he also makes reference to the fact that when you look through mythologies all throughout the world, over and over and over again, you see the fall, meaning some angelic creature or demigod or some powerful being, not the most powerful being by any means, but some powerful being that falls. And hence you have that Satan figure that comes up in all different mythologies. Now, he personally believed, and he told his friend, Milton Waldman, I believe it because I believe that really happened. And I think that's why it's come in all these mythologies, and that's why I put it in my own. So there is that kind of satanic figure there, an angel, or in this case, a higher being, like a higher elf that went bad and things went bad. Are they allowed to stay on Earth forever? No, they're not. They're supposed to come back. Can they be killed? Yes. Not by old age necessarily. Although sometimes when you read some of Tolkien's references, he makes reference they can live thousands of years, but really they could die by accident or combat or things like that. So to him, it's definitely a higher being that is supposed to be guiding man. And that comes through very clearly, especially in the Silmarillion, when some of them go bad and some of them stay good. What I think is important for our discussion, though, too, is to come back to something that we looked at last week. And I'm going to build off it this time. Do you remember, for those that were here, and for those that weren't, Johnny, this will be kind of directed at you because I know you like Tolkien. You know that when we talked about the dwarves last week, for those that were here, there's this episode in the first of the trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, when they make it to a place called Moria. And this is a dwarven stronghold. And it's very clear in the book that the dwarves and the elves don't get along. Gimli and his other companion Legolas don't get along. And we talked about that a little bit last week. And I usually get asked when I'm showing that movie to someone or someone's watching it for the first time, I don't get it. Why is it when you look at this door, it's a secret door that only kind of lights up in the moonlight, and it has a secret code word you have to say for the door to open. It's kind of a magical door. Why is the writing in Elvish and not Dwarvish? And we gave a little hint to that last week. I want to spend a little bit more time on that door, if you'll allow me. So let's go there real quick. And here you'll see this is an image of the door that shows up when if you pick up the trilogy or even the Fellowship of the Ring, the first book, usually this image is in there because Tolkien sketched this originally. The door has this kind of image on it. It's engraved into the mountain. And again, it's very flush with the mountain. So only in the moonlight will the moonlight reflect off of all of this inscription, all of the filigree and so forth, because this beautiful material that the dwarves love to mine, something called mithril silver, a beautiful silver. It's very malleable and very expensive, that it would be inlaid in the mountain. And when it lights up at night, you see where the door is, and then you speak the password, hooray. Well, that's not the password. You see the password, and hooray, the door is open. Well, we broke down some of the imagery from this last week. It was the founder of the dwarven family, Durin, who also founded the city, who put this image, and one of this image on the door, 7 stars over a crown. He apparently saw that in the reflection of the lake one night when he was visiting. And he said, this is a great sign. I must build a city here. So that went on the door. Also, his family crest, a hammer and anvil. Dwarves are known for their craftsmanship. But then you have all these references to elves. The 2 trees here reference the 2 trees that the elves have that are mentioned in the Silmarillion. You see that kind of tree of life and tree of knowledge of good and bad reference that would be in the Genesis account, gets pulled into Tolkien's writings, and it represents elves. And then you have a family crest here, a very well-known and very high-ranking noble family of the elves. And the reason for this is because apparently at one time there was a beautiful harmonious relationship with the elves that lived outside of Moria, the elves of Eregion, the ones that crafted the magical rings. They had a good trade and friendship relationship with the dwarves of Moria, and it was said that the doors were always open. There was no reason to close them, that they would go through. And so it is a particular elf named Celebrimbor who actually put the writing here. This is part of the inscription. I put it here for you because obviously not many of us can read Elvish. I know I can't. And this is what's inscribed. I Narvi, the name of a dwarf craftsman. I Narvi made them, meaning I made the doors. Celebrimbor, a very well-known elf craftsman of Holland, drew these signs. The doors of Durin, meaning my forefather Durin, Lord of Moria. And I hope you caught the reference for those that know Tolkien very well. Do you notice it says, say friend and enter? Technically, when Gandalf reads the speech, he mistranslates it to speak friend and enter. So if you go back earlier, you get the reference. It's actually supposed to say friend and enter. And of course, the word that opens the door is Melon, the elven word for friend. So that is really representative of the fact that there's this gorgeous relationship between these two races, something that's highlighted in Tolkien's mythology. Remember last week, for those that were here, Tolkien was very, very affected by what he went through in World War I. And coming out of World War I, as many people did, wondering, why was I shooting at somebody of my faith? Why were Catholics shooting at Catholics? Why were Protestants shooting at Protestants? Why were Jews shooting at Jews? I don't get it. A whole generation that returned from that war was plagued by that. And so you kind of see that either consciously or subconsciously being put into the story. There was a time when these two races of dignified peoples had a beautiful relationship with one another, but over time, a racism had built up. A couple quick references why, if you're curious why. When Sauron had risen to power during the Second Age, he attacked outside Eregion, outside of Mordor, and the dwarves closed the doors. And they sealed it for a long period of time. And during that period of time, a rift had kind of grew between those cultures. And it's in the Lord of the Rings series when you see the cultures come back again in a beautiful way, I have to say, through these characters who we showed last week, Gimli and Legolas. And we made a big deal over Gimli last week. Gimli certainly was the quintessential dwarf, especially because unlike The Hobbit, where you're reading about 13 dwarves that are kind of spoken of in a collective, where every once in a while one of the dwarves will speak, here you get to understand one particular dwarf's personality. And you see him over 3 books, about 900 to 1,000 pages of writing. And here his companion, Legolas, this tremendous racism between them. You can hear it with arguments between them, snide remarks between them, that those remarks start to soften throughout the books as they come to understand one another. They're fighting on the same side. They're fighting against the great evil together. And at the very end of those books, they go off. After everything's solved, the big bad guy is defeated, they go off and show each other the different realms of their respective peoples, sharing that with one another. So I think that's an important imagery that comes in. And the reason I made a big deal over this is just to show you the ripple effect of Tolkien's mythology. It is amazing to me how many fantasy books, video games, movies that deal with it, even in the science fiction world. If they ever give a science fiction version of dwarves or elves, there's always this, often I should say, this reference to a time when they got along, but they don't get along now. And why? Because, well, the personality differences between them, there's a racism between them. So it's interesting how Tolkien dropped that pebble in the pond, so to speak, and that ripple effect is coming down all these decades later into so many other writings. Where did Tolkien get his ideas from? Okay, obviously he didn't invent the concept of elves. He massaged some of that concept from his own biblical references and his own faith. Dwarves, of course, we mentioned last week, he went back into Norse teaching. So it's probably a good idea we look at the dwarves for a little bit of time. And then, of course, we'll come back to Tolkien a little bit later. So let's do that. Let's just go into Norse. And again, for Miss is it, I'm trying to remember your name again. Is it Eileen or Irene? Zen Kurt? Your daughter-in-law is a Norse scholar.
Linda.
Linda, thank you again, Linda.
Right. Yeah, write it down so you'll know.
Yes,
So
I
you
just
know
wrote
all the other times I come.
Thanks, Linda. Linda, share with your daughter-in-law, okay? The Norse view of the universe. So if you're familiar with this, the Norse had this idea, at least as far as we can tell, and I say as far as we can tell, I pause on this, because the Norse sources that we have, all of which are written in the 1200s, the 13th century, are technically very late as far as we're concerned. Really, the Viking age, or the age of this great Norse culture of the Swedes and the Danish and the Norwegian Vikings, it falls between the late 700s and the mid 1000s. If you want me to be exact, I will. Most scholars will say 793. That's the Viking age begins. 1066, the Viking age ends, because at that point, the Vikings have mixed into most cultures, English, French, and whatnot, and have become Christianized. So these are writers that are writing about 150 years to 180 years out from the end of the Viking age, but it's all we have. We have the work of great scholars, one Icelandic scholar by the name of Snorri Sturluson, who was mentioned last week, who had compiled some of the poetic Edda or poetic saga of the early 1200s, the prose Edda or prose saga, and the Vulsana saga. These three are the primary sources that people go to because it's what apparently was handed down from great-grandparents to grandparents to kids to these writers. So it's what we study. And it's tough because the earlier references almost have just no continuity. And I know we as human beings love continuity. I have this with my students constantly as a college teacher. They want things very black and white. So you study Greek mythology, for example, and you say, okay, well, who's Poseidon? He's god of the sea. Okay. Sometimes he's not. Sometimes he's a god of something else, because don't forget, there's no real pope equivalent among the Greeks. Yes, they had some structure, like with the Oracle of Delphi, if you're familiar, some kind of structure of pulling together, these different versions. With the Vikings, it's even more diverse. And from that, I'm going to reference one of the best known, and please, Eileen, I'm sorry, I should say Linda, write down this name, Neil Price, Price, Neil Price. He is one of the best known and accomplished Viking scholars today who specialize in Viking religion. And he will tell you Uppsala, Sweden. That's one of the best known universities for the subject in the world. Again, Neil Price is his name. Anyone can look him up. He's a very nice writer, and I think even his speeches are very eloquent.
Have a comment. I'll have a comment on this next time.
Yes, please do. Please, I'm sure she'll love it. Really tells you it's difficult because just like Thor, you want to say he's the god of thunder, and then sometimes he's not. There really was nothing pulling all of Viking religion together. It seems like it was a very local thing. It was a very family or community oriented thing. And also the fact that religion seems to have been in the hands of the wife in the family, that the women were the ones involved in prayer and so forth. And that's why what I'm showing you here is about as simplified as we can get. So I really want you to take what I'm showing you with a grain of salt. We do get this image of this tree. And whether the life tree concept comes out of the book of Genesis, I don't know. That's the jury's kind of still out on that one. But the idea that the Vikings had is that the entire universe is connected by this tree. And I'll point where we live. See, we live here. You and I live here in a place called Midgard. You kind of see where Tolkien got the idea of Middle Earth, Midgard. Okay, this is where we live. It's very flat. Okay, they thought it was flat. If you want to go to heaven, well, that's Asgard. That's where the gods live. The tree is called Yggdrasil. Okay, it's this life tree. There's a bifrost or rainbow that connects the different worlds together that can be traveled with permission. But then you get this concept of these different overlapping, or these different spheres. For example, a sphere like Niflheim as an example, or Nurlheim and whatnot. Elfheim, which is depicted back here. I know the text is a little tricky. That's apparently where elves live. So there's a place in Norse belief. There's a realm where the elves live. Well, this here looks very geographic. It looks like, okay, I live here and giants live here and, dwarves live here. But what we're not getting from this is that to the Norse mind, we think these worlds overlap one another. And there can be some kind of travel on these almost overlays of different worlds. And that's what makes it kind of a difficult thing. Now, if you're wondering where the Norse or the Vikings would get this idea from, there's a theory. Please, I'm making it very clear, it's a theory. This is not universally believed by every Norse scholar. But if you were to look at the stars at night from the viewpoint of places in Scandinavia, you kind of see where you have this kind of aurora borealis kind of development, this Milky Way. And again, if you're talking a place where there's no city lights, so what would have looked like 1,200 years ago or more, you can kind of see where they have this idea that there's this connection through the sky, almost this tree-like shape that may exist. Again, I'm not saying you have to believe this is what they believe. I'm just saying it is a theory out there. So why I say this is a very important concept is because while dwarves in Viking belief are somewhat concrete, we mentioned this last week. So for those that weren't here, they live in the ground. They love crafting things. They can mine very well. They live a long life, but they're not immortal. They're very strong. Okay, they have a long memory. They can be very stubborn. All those things have kind of stayed throughout dwarven references, right up to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's not that way with elves. Elves sometimes are portrayed as enemies. Sometimes they get your cattle sick. Sometimes they're your friends. Sometimes they're spirit-like, so almost demigod-like. Other times they're a creature, so now corporeal body. And what really gets tricky, I'm going to show you that reference again, because I put this on screen for a reason. This concept that there's this god Freyr, okay, of the family of Vanir, which is a family of gods, has this elf homeland of Alfheim. And in this one poem, and it's just one poem in a collection of poems, you see what I mean? There's no continuity here, that the elves could actually designate a family of gods. Well, that is not how most of us think of them. All I'm trying to show you is that it is so nebulous of a subject. What elves were. Were they tall? Were they short? Were they good? Were they bad? What did they look like? But there's one feature that does come out that's common among all these different concepts. They have magical power. And that has to be respected. So that reference that I gave you earlier, and I'm gonna come back again to the table of contents for you, because I think it's of note. The invisible population. This is not my term. This is the term that's used by Neil Price and his colleagues. The belief may very well have been that these elves had existed amongst humans. The worlds transfer over one another. And so while you can't see them, they can hurt you. They can make your crops either grow or not grow. So we do have reason to believe, and we have this reason to believe because of later references in later centuries of people still doing this. People that will actually go outside their home and put some kind of offering on a rock or a tree stump to the elves, usually butter or maybe some fruit or vegetables. And the theory being is that they're giving this offering to these beings because they don't want to get sick, and they don't want their cattle to be injured, and they don't want any kind of problem. So they show this kind of respect. So if that sounds kind of new to you, what I want to tell you is there are people today that still hold to that belief. And that's why I started this lecture the way I did. That no matter what my belief is, I don't step on the beliefs of others. You'd be surprised some of the statistics that I found. I don't want to quote statistics all the time because, as we know, one poll says one thing and one survey says another, and it can be very manipulated statistics. But I did find it interesting that some of the questions that have been asked in these polls, do you believe in elves? And there's actually a pretty good percentage that you see, especially in Scandinavian countries, people that believe that they still exist and that they're an invisible population that is around them. And when sometimes asked, do you say that they don't exist? A very high number of people came through in a lot of those surveys I've seen that said, well, I don't want to say they don't because they might. Now, let me show you how we can see that in true order. I want to show you a place in Iceland, just a couple pictures. You may be familiar with this. Is anyone here familiar with a place called Elves Hill? That's not how you pronounce it in English. It's like Elfhull or something like that. My Icelandic is terrible. So what I mean terrible is I don't know any Icelandic words. I just want to show you this image here of Elves Hill. Now, if you look closely at this rock, you'll see there's a little home that's built here. And just to give you another shot of if you were to go around this mountain area here, here's another image. And I purposely made sure to give you a picture with someone's legs in it so you can get a scale reference to how small this is. There is a movie, it was a hilarious movie. I'm saying I'm going to recommend it because it wasn't the greatest movie, but there was a movie with Will Ferrell where he plays a singer in Iceland. And there's a whole little episode, him with the elves in this place. I just want to make a reference to that. So this is a little closer view of those elves' homes. Now, why I'm showing this to you is because I want to tell you that in this mountainside that you saw in those pictures, back in the 1930s, so about 90 years ago, there was an effort on the part of the Icelandic government to build a state road through that mountain. They were going to literally drill a tunnel and work their way through the mountain. Then these things started happening. The drill broke. So they got a replacement drill. That drill broke. Then they ended up getting more machinery. And then people were complaining the machinery was getting damaged at night, missing and so forth. So this rumor went around, and I'm saying this because, again, there's different beliefs on this, of course. Was this a historic site? Yes, this was called Elves Hill for a long time. Are the elves preventing this from happening? Now, if you find that interesting, can I bring it a little closer to today? In the 1980s, so now we're not that, now we're in the lifetime of some of us here, myself included, okay? In the 1980s, there was another effort to build a state road in that area. And the same kind of thing started happening. News reporters were actually saying that when they pointed their cameras at this rock, the cameras wouldn't work. And it got them very spooked. And as a result, by about the year 1990, a federal law got enacted in Iceland that in order to build, we have to first assess if this is an historic site. And Elves Hill can be visited today. It is unmolested. Just so you know, I've watched some videos in preparation for this lecture tonight, some YouTube videos of interviews with people that work for the state government in Iceland, being interviewed by English reporters and whatnot. What is your opinion on elves? And you kind of see them getting a little quiet and saying, well, it's nice to think that they may exist because it's very possible, but we have to be careful. And literally, these laws are still in effect today. In fact, from what I've done in my research, many times if there's an area they're not sure of, they bring in mythology experts to study the area. if you go to this particular rock in Elves Hill, there's actually a number of homes, and then there's one area that's left blank, and the number skips over. So it's like, if you go like odd numbers, there's 1, 3, 5, 7. You go to 11. 9, you don't go 9 because you have to give respect to the invisible population. Some of my very students that I've taught at County College of Morris have told me that they and their families still hold to this belief. Some of them that come from Norwegian background that still go into even in New Jersey, they'll go into their backyard and will leave an offering. So I just want to let you know that what we're talking about is very current. It's not just something medieval. It's funny how this is carried through time, because as you can imagine, the English were very affected by Norse religion. We already said that Tolkien was. Well, why? Well, don't forget the Vikings invaded England first in the very late 700s, 793 to be exact. And through decade after decade into the 800s, they made such incursions that they were able to actually stay. And what I'd like to show you is something you may have seen before. I'm going to just pull up a map here of England. I think this would be good to appreciate. England as it would be seen in the 800s, the 9th century. There was no United England yet. There was no one king of England in the 800s. The first king of England will not come to the 900s. But what you did as kings in places like, now Doug, how many times you've gone up to Newcastle? That's the region of Northumbria. That was a kingdom of Northumbria. There was a place called Mercia, and then some of the counties that are in England today, like Essex and Wessex and Sussex, which of course we have counties today here, they were originally kingdoms. The kingdoms, for example, of Wessex, West Saxons, or the Saxon people, of Sussex, the South Saxons. But are you taking note that there's a very large section on this map that is called the Danelaw? A very large section that is held by Danish settlers, where Danish or Viking law prevailed. And so is it any wonder that the literature that we see coming out of very early England, for those of you that read Beowulf, which I referenced in my Dragon series, for those that got a chance to attend that, is steeped, although it's a Christian writing very much, it's steeped in imagery that comes from the Vikings. So is it any surprise that there would be a belief in elves, maybe not in Beowulf, so to speak, but among the English? And I can tell you, you can go to, you're sitting down for this. I'm glad you're sitting down, because this is what I'm going to tell you next. In Anglo-Saxon, that's early English, in Anglo-Saxon medical texts, there were references to elves. There was something known as elf shot. So if somebody was suffering, today we would think of things like jaundice, arthritis, internal pains that couldn't be explained. The invisible population was sometimes referenced. Why? The theories that are today, and this is based on the fact that there were references back in the medieval age to this, very small communities where they would unearth ancient Neolithic, you might say, arrowheads. Of course, for those that have visited England, Doug, I know you've been to England many times, Samantha, you too. Okay, if you've seen Stonehenge, I never got a chance to see that. You're looking at something that is definitely, it's not medieval, it's very ancient. There are ancient cultures there. And when they unearth these arrowheads that look very odd, sometimes arrowheads made of stone, these must be the arrows of the elves. They're magical arrow things that are left behind. And there's this idea that they can shoot you with these magical arrows and you can get sick. So you better be nice to the elves. Now, as the centuries went on, when you get more like into the 15 and 1600s, you don't really have elves hurting humans so much. I mean, don't forget, if you're familiar with any of the writings of Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, you have a figure there, Puck. Is he an elf? Is he a fairy? I don't know. Well, again, elves are very, very nebulous and sometimes good and sometimes bad. But by his period of time, 15 into the 1600s, now it's like, well, elves can affect your cattle. They don't so much affect you anymore. And if I were to tell you, and this is a hint, ladies and gentlemen, for how we're going to conclude today's lecture, don't forget we have some other areas to cover. It was said in Anglo-Saxon texts and Germanic texts in mainland Europe that elves could steal your children. In many cases, if a child was sick and not acting themselves, the accusation was that the elves came, stole your child, and replaced it with their child in disguise. I'm not making this up. These were beliefs. So that is not a Tolkien thing, is it? By any means. And it's certainly not a Santa's nice elf by any means either. So what you're kind of getting is this middle ground. One thing is they have power. It's a good opportunity for me to stop and just see if there's any questions or thoughts you have before we go on to the worker elves and how do we get Santa's little elves and also maybe elves mixing batches of cookies in a tree. Linda, your question. Go ahead, Linda.
I try to put this in the chat before, but apparently I don't know how to do that. I recently visited Iceland a few years ago, and they do tell the same stories you did about the magic of, I think they call them the little people. And they're talking about a road through the country that the government felt was necessary, but they had all kind of problems on 2 attempts. On the 3rd attempt, the road was able to go through, but it had to make a lot of curves and turns. It had to go very much out of its way. It couldn't go straight because for some reason, like you say, the equipment didn't work. They were kind of guided on where that road was supposed to go.
Yeah.
I mean, we heard different versions of this story wherever we went, and their folklore about the little people, it affects everything. It seems like their food, the way they set the table, the way their homes are set up. I'm sure it's just for tourists, but it is very big, very, very much a part of the tourist genre.
Yes, I would agree. And can I give you just something else that's been said in some scholarship I came across? The opposite thinking to that is sometimes people may say, and as I've come across this, well, maybe they don't really believe in elves. Maybe it's just a convenient belief in order to have conservation kind of efforts to respect the old sites. So, and the reason I'm saying that is because it's very much a two-sided coin.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I just say that because, and I've seen that from interviews with Icelandic people, you know, that may have one take on that or the other. But excellent point that you bring up.
Yeah.
I'd like to just show you real quick. Oh, I'm sorry. Did anybody else have a comment or something they'd like to contribute? I know you have a lot of people that love the elves here. I'm going to talk about them. Except for Helen Clemente. She can't stand the subject. She's just here to support the Denville Library. Thanks, Mom, for being here. Okay. How do we get elves in, let's say, worker concept? Well, I want to take you back again to Grimm, the brothers Grimm, Jakob and Wilhelm, who back in 1812, during the Napoleonic era, had really codified the different Germanic stories. One that's very pronounced, you may know, a very short story, about 5 pages or so, is the Elves and the Shoemaker. And if you know that story very well, the elves are naked in the story. They help the shoemaker out of their kindness. The shoemaker and his wife eventually make them clothes, and they're very happy, and they go away, and the shoemaker is now wealthy and so forth. But the concept you get is the worker elf. Go ahead on your own if you want to. I didn't belabor this with many images, but I just did a Google search of artwork in the last 210 years. We're 210 years out from the writing of the story. How many ways those elves have been portrayed? Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes they're with wings, like a fairy. Sometimes they look like little men and little women, sometimes bearded, sometimes not. Sometimes you'd swear it was a goblin, sometimes green. Again, even in the history that we have in more recent years, before Tolkien comes through and kind of codifies or standardizes the elf concept, you have this very nebulous thing, how they're portrayed. And many times, elf, goblin, and fairy kind of all cross over one another. In any event, they are powerful in the sense that they have magical powers and they can help people if they want to. So how does that end up in Christmas? All right. Well, I have a couple key texts here that I'm going to bring up. I just put them down for you. Clement Clark Moore, 1822. So we're 10 years after Grimm's fairy tales. He wrote the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. If that does not sound familiar, how about the alternate title? The Night Before Christmas. Does that sound familiar? Yes. There is a key line in there that describes Santa himself. Remember, Santa has gone through a tremendous evolution from the 1500s up to the 1920s in look, appearance, and behavior. There was a time when Santa used to go door to door with the devil, and the devil would beat bad kids, and Santa was thin. Okay, so what you have by 1822 is Santa being described as chubby and plump, and he is in the same line described as a right jolly old elf. Magical creature. Now, adding to that, 1850s, 1856, and I know Samantha will know this off the top of her head, a woman named Louisa May Alcott. I think she wrote some other books, right? Yeah, maybe one that was about some women, and that happened to be Little Women, right? Okay, she happened to have also written an unpublished book called Christmas Elves. So now through her writing, unpublished it may be, at least you know she's talking at a time and she's writing something where maybe there's a murmur among the European and American community to associate elves in this workshop kind of environment with Santa. And then by the time you get to Harper's Weekly, and this is Harper's Weekly, was a very, very well-known journal. It was in its opening year, 1857, there was a published poem called The Wonders of Santa Claus. I'll read you a line here from that poem. In his house upon the top of a hill and almost out of sight, he keeps a great many elves at work, all working with all their might. And from that, we get the concept of the worker elf, who, as you know, is not just helping Santa. You have this gentleman. Does anybody know who this gentleman is, what he's named? You know, it's Keebler Cookies. Does anybody know what the head elf is called? He's got a name. It's a name that some men have. Who's got it?
I said Roger.
Is that because of that friend you had, Roger the elf? I remember that little guy. Thanks, Doug. Doug had a friend years ago we thought looked like him. His name is Ernie. And as you know, him and his friends are mixing batches of cookies and treat. They work very hard to make your cookies. How about Snap, Crackle, and Pop? Snap, Crackle, and Pop first come onto the scene in the 1930s. First, it's just Snap. And the whole reason for that is because it's kind of an onomatopoeia. For those that know your English references, you know, words that have a sound to them. Okay, so you're going to hear the snap, crackle, and pop. And we got started using radio ads, and eventually it gets put on the box. And what are they doing? They're working really hard to make your cereal. So it's no wonder that you and I sometimes put our hands up at the beginning. What was the elf that you thought of? Did you think of Glorfindel, this powerful elf who rides like the wind to the rescue of the fellow heroes? Or do you see the little tiny guy, or sometimes even tiny little women that are helping and working? Hopefully you're getting where the references are coming from. I'd like to show you just one more thing before I take some questions. Remember, I promised to come back to Tolkien just to show you how even Tolkien's, not so much Tolkien himself, but people trying to give a movie adaptation of Tolkien could be influenced by either the strong elf or the worker elf or the goblin elf or the fairy elf or whatever. Let me show you this. I know some of you here are very well versed in some of the Tolkien films, and I just wanted to show you a particular character named Elrond. He's a character I love in the stories. He shows up also in the appendices, a very powerful elf, thousands of years old by the time you see him in the story. His father was a dragon slayer, actually in the Silmarillion, slew one of the greatest dragons ever. And here you see him depicted by Hugo Weaving, very good actor, in my opinion, did a great job to capture the dignity, the wisdom, the intelligence, the seriousness, yet the kindness of this character invented by Tolkien. Well, you can look here at how he was portrayed in 1978. In a 1978 cartoon, that was somewhat of a cartoon, somewhat live action. It was by an animator named Ralph Bakshi, who really was a genius for his time. He did something called rotoscoping, filming people and then drawing over the film to look like cartoon. Here you see the depiction of Elrond in a very similar scene, listening to people, the main characters, about what they found. Of course, you could go to 1980, just a couple of years later, and you've got another depiction of Elrond in the follow-up, which I thought was terrible, mind you, in my opinion. This I thought was brilliant. The follow-up, the Fellowship of the Return of the King movie, animated film, straight cartoon, no rotoscoping. Here you have kind of a, I don't know, he's a little scary to me. Another depiction, same character, ladies and gentlemen, same character. I'd like to show you just another comparison tip. Let's go to the quintessential elf who I mentioned before, Legolas. Okay, Orlando Bloom was just a 19 or 20-year-old man. Orlando Bloom got the role in the 2001, 2002, and 2003 films. It launched his career and launched a fan site because women all over the world just thought this guy was, very good looking, because he is. Well, how is Legolas, this elf, portrayed in the 1978 Ralph Bakshi film? He was portrayed this way. So it's like, okay, well, I could see it's a little happier, a little less serious, nonetheless, nimble, but maybe not the same stature and power that you'd see of a very tall, athletic actor like Legolas. But why I'm doing this, ladies and gentlemen, is there's a shock value I want to provide right here. How many of you here have personally seen these films? 2001, 2002, and 2003, the Lord of the Rings films. Good. Now I'm going to ask, how many of you had the chance to see the 2012, 2013, and 2014 trilogy of The Hobbit, also produced by Peter Jackson, okay, which is a real departure from the original story, but nonetheless, okay. What if I were to tell you the father of Legolas is a very, and I saw you mouth the name, Samantha, Thranduil, the king of the wood elves living in Mirkwood. Legolas is a powerful prince, but this is his father of a noble family. And he is portrayed by the very, very good-looking actor Lee Pace, who does an awesome job, in my opinion, of capturing an anger that's very controlled, a racism that has to be overcome, a dignity, a little bit of an arrogance there at times, really just, and yet a military prowess and a command of presence, beautifully done. Now, what I'd like to do is bring you back again to this Legolas. And this is Legolas in the live action. This is Legolas in the cartoon. Would you like to see the portrayal of Legolas' father? This is Legolas' father, played by Lee Pace. Please look at how this is Thranduil, Legolas' father. Look at how Thranduil, King of the Elves, is portrayed in the late 1970s Hobbit movie. You would swear it's a goblin. He's green, he's decrepit, he's evil looking, and all the goblins in that Hobbit animated film of the 1970s are portrayed in this very scary manner. Is it because they treated the main characters in the story badly? I don't know, but there's a meme out there, if you know what that is, that's on the internet asking, when you look back at these frames, was Legolas adopted? That's one of the memes that's out there, by the way, because again, the portrayal of his father looks so different. The reason I bring this up is it possible that the 1970s film, animated film, was pulling from all those other references that we talked about, very nebulous references to goblins and elves and fairies and how they can sometimes look alike. This is a good opportunity for me to ask you for any of your contributions, any questions you may have, whether it be about the Norse belief, Grimm's fairy tales, where Elven literature is today, you may have a question, or anything that we may have talked about. Can I throw one more thing at you if you're struggling for a question? Something else, and this is something, Linda, for you to throw by your daughter-in-law. Most people that are into fantasy genre look at elves in three different ways. high elves that live in the cities, wood elves that live in the forest, and dark elves that can be darker of skin, evil, sometimes dark gray. Sometimes they turn to piracy and banditry. They're very angry and so forth. There are a concept of dark elves that are mentioned in Norse literature, in the Poetic Edda. It's there, the oldest of what we have. But here's what's very new. We thought, and I thought this 20 years ago when I was in college, when I was taking mythology classes with some of the experts I studied under, and they said, well, the dark elves were mentioned, so evil elves were there. In the more recent years, last 5 years in particular, the scholarship has changed. We think that what the Norse meant by dark elf being very oily of skin, dark skin and whatnot, short and hairy, we think that they were talking about dwarves. That dwarves were referred to as dark elves, meaning the enemy of the other invisible populace. So just a little side point. If you are interested in any of the 37 books that have been written on this series here, the Drist novels by R.A. Salvatore and Maine Library and the Denver Library has plenty of these books, 37 books, all starring a main character who's a dark elf. So that's from 1988 down to 2020, 37 books written on this one character. So don't tell me elves are out of fashion by any means. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to conclude, and I have to ask you a question. Was Rumpelstiltskin an elf? You said collectively last week he's not a dwarf. Was he an elf? He's only said to be a little man. How many say it's possible? Remember what Rumpelstiltskin wanted? The firstborn child of the miller's daughter. I don't want the wealth. I want the living creature. Is there anyone here that kind of think it's possible? Okay, it's very possible. I know Samantha will fight that tooth and nail because to her, that is not an elf. To her, the elves are those like Elrond and Glorfindel and so forth, and the great glorious ones. So one last little look, if I can just show you, going back before we make our conclusion. I really hope to see some of you, if not all of you, back next week. I know schedules may not permit. What do you take away from today's discussion? What is an elf to you? It certainly is something popular the world over in many different forms. So I thank you for being here. I'll stay back for a question or two, of course. I really respect some of you have places to go. And I hope to see you next week because we do have a lecture, right, Heather? One lecture schedule next week, same time, same channel.
Same time.
Yeah.
Yep,
On
same
goblins. Hey, we got to talk about goblins, when they came about, what they were.
Any questions?
Thank you very much for being here. Mom, did I hold your attention today? I hope. Somewhat.
Yes, somewhat.
Okay, when we got into the medical stuff, that right, probably picked up your okay. So you complain sometimes of arthritis, Mom.
I've got it now.
Is that elf shot?
What?
Is it elf shot? Did an elf shoot you with a magical arrow? That's what the Anglo-Saxons believed.
Oh, I could use one of those those things right
You want
now.
them to heal you. They can heal you too, apparently.
Oh God, I think the weather's changing. It's starting.
Well, okay. Well, hopefully it's not that in elves. Linda, please let me know if you're going to be here next week. I'd love to find out if your daughter-in-law had added anything.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to get in touch with her right now.
Thank you
See
so
you
much.
next week.
And Heather, thank you for
It was
having
interesting.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you all next week.
that, Doug.
Told Helen's firstborn.
Nice job, Alex.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks for being. Thanks, Doug.
What did you say, Doug?
I think an elf stole your firstborn son.
Oh, I think he
Could
did.
be.
Alex was very sickly when he was younger.
I
He
was. I had a heart
pain.
condition. And by the way, don't forget, we have someone here of Norse origin. One of my best students, Charlotte Otteson, is here.
Oh,
Right? She's a Viking blood. She'll tell you. She said, be careful of those elves.
good night. How's Jackie, Doug?
She's good. She just got home from work.
Tell Jackie we said hi.
Yes, tell her we said hi.
And
How
tell your
is
parents I said hi too.
how is what's his name?
Now, just so you know, Ma, Heather does have to close up. I just want
Oh, okay, all right.
Doug, you
Take
have
care.
extra you know,
She's got a
Heather
whole
is,
list
you know,
of people
she's
she
work
wants
right
to
now. Just,
Oh, Jim Haywood. I was thinking of Jim Haywood. How was Jim?
I don't know. I hope to see him. I'm going to, in fact, I was going to be in Newcastle in about 4 weeks, but I think I'm not going to Newcastle now.
that's Northumbria, Doug. Don't forget that.
Yeah.
Okay, good night.
Across the Pennines from Cumbria.
Very good. Thanks, guys. And thank you, Heather.
Thanks,
Thanks.
guys.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
There's a leap. Oh.